Hello everyone and welcome to the Money and Metals Network Coin Talk. My name is Campbell and today I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Dr. Carl Savage, who brings a wealth of experience and expertise in the field of medieval and post-medieval numismatics. Carl joined the Treasure Trove Unit in September 2022 following 4 years as a CDP researcher within the department. During that time, he worked closely with both the Treasure Trove Unit and the Portable Antiquities Scheme in England, contributing specialist reports on single coin finds and hoards. Carl is a seasoned numismatist with a particular focus on Scotland and Northern England. His passion lies in Scottish coinage, and he has recently completed a die study and developed a new classification of the early coinage of David II. His research has been widely published in peer-reviewed journals and specialist magazines, and he has presented at leading conferences, including the International Medieval Congress and the SCBI series. Carl is also actively involved in professional development and training, having delivered numismatic sessions for organisations like PASS and Treasure Trove and also the Money and Metals Network. His professional affiliations include membership in the British Numismatic Society, the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, and the Scottish Medievalists. Most recently, he was elected as a junior research committee member for the British Academy's Catalogue of Coins of the British Isles and Medieval Coinage in Europe projects. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Archaeology from the University of Central Lancashire and an MA in Medieval Archaeology from the University of York. He's also just completed his PhD, also with the University of York and National Museum Scotland, on coinage, landscape and society in the borderlands, economy, politics and identity in Scotland and Northern England, 1136 to 1603, which I believe he's also turning into a book. So as usual with these, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat. I will go through them with Carl at the end. And without further ado, I'll pass you over to Dr. Carl Savage.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Campbell. I've got to say that PhD title is a mouthful. I'm going to try and shorten it. So without further ado, so this is the second part of the talk on Scottish coinage. So this one will be focusing on Robert III to James VI to the Union of the Crowns in 1603. So in this talk, I will be largely talking about sort of a brief history of the development of the Scottish coinage, but also some of the symbolism and the meanings behind the iconography and how that relates to outside influences on the design of Scottish coinage and their political meanings for political situations in Scotland throughout the 15th and 16th centuries. So before we dive into this, so just a quick recap from the first talk. So the first Scottish native coins were introduced under David I in either late 1135 or 1136. And between 1195 and 1367, the Scottish coins were more or less minted the same standard as the English coins. However, change occurred in 1367 when Scottish coins became lighter than the English ones. And it is these changes that I will start to pick up on as we go through the late 14th, 15th and 16th centuries in this talk. So our journey begins in this second part with the reign of Robert III. Principally, what I'll talk about here is that the act, a really important act in 1393, brought about large changes to the Scottish coinage. This act also saw the introduction of Scotland's first sustainable and successful gold coinage, the lion, which was worth 5 shillings, and the demi-lion, which was worth 2 shillings and 6 pence. If we remember from our previous talk, there was a previous very short-lived gold coinage introduced under David II in 1358, but the 1393 Act brought about Scotland's first sustainable gold coinage. We also see change in the design of the coinage as well in 1393, and I'll talk more about that design change when I show you a couple of examples in the next couple of slides. We also see a change in the silver composition of the lower denomination, so the penny and the halfpenny, which is now produced in debased silver. And later on, towards the end of Robert III's reign, we see a further weight reduction in 1403 with the coinage. So I'll just talk a bit more about some of these examples of what these new coin designs entail. So the gold coin, the gold lion, actually shows interesting designs. The obverse design shows the crowned lion, so representing the Scottish royal authority, a symbol of Scottish royal power. It is believed that the obverse design imitates the French écu à la couronne, which was issued in France from the reign of Philip VI in the mid 14th century. And interestingly, on the reverse, we see St. Andrew's crucified on the cross. So this is the first time on Scottish coinage we actually see St. Andrew depict the Saint Andrews depicted on a coin as Scotland's national saint. Switching now to the silver denominations, we see a complete change of design from what we saw previously, whereas the Scottish monarchs were always shown in profile with a scepter in front of them. That's now gone. Instead, we now have a facing bust, very similar to what we see on the corresponding larger English silver coins. The reverse design of the silver groats has also changed. Previously, in each of the angles of the cross, there was 5-pointed mullets or stars. Now these have been replaced with 3 pellets, again, which is very similar to what we see on the corresponding English coinage. Now, there's a perceived reason for why Robert and the Scottish government wanted to change these silver Scottish coins to be more like the English. Now, you may recall that the weight reductions in the Scottish coinage meant that Scottish coins in England were now beginning to be worth less. So a Scottish groat, originally worth 4 pence, was now worth 2 pence in England from the 1390s. And gradually, as this value got worse, and following the debasement of the Scottish coinage, Scottish coins were pretty much banned in England altogether. So one idea is that the design making the Scottish silver coins look like the English coins was to try and cheekily try and pass them off at the same value as English coins at 4 pence. But given the fact that Scottish coins were outlawed in England from the 14th century, it looks like it didn't really fool anybody in England. And that can be attested by the amount of the decline of the single fines that we're seeing, the single Scottish fines from Robert III's reign in England, so that nobody was fooled by this perceived change of design to try and pass them off as similar to English coins, even though they were not. They were produced at a lighter weight. And so this other example here shows that the pennies, the smaller denominations, also made in debased silver, also followed the same basic design of the English coins, again trying to pass them off with the same value as English coins, even though the Scottish coins were made to a lighter standard. And following sort of the weight reduction again in 1403 under Robert, the coins basically got lighter, and this example shown on the slide on the right of the slide is a light coinage groat minted at Dunbarton. So I won't go into the stylistical typologies of the difference between heavy groats and light groats too much. So that basically covers the reign of Robert III. Now we come to James I, Robert's successor. So with James, he was captured in early 1406 by English pirates as he was attempting to flee Scotland to the safety of France, because James's unscrupulous and very ruthless uncle, Robert, Duke of Albany, who was effectively running the country during Robert III's reign, also tried to do the same after Robert III had died. So James was captured by English pirates, fleeing to the safety of France, and then transferred to English custody under Henry IV. So James spent the next sort of 20 years in English captivity, where he witnessed successful and aggressive kingships, particularly that under Henry V. And following his release in 1424, one of James's first priorities was to re-establish royal control in Scotland, which had long been lapsed under Robert III, and the Scottish government and power had long been in the hands of Robert, Duke of Albany, and the Albany Stuarts. So one of James's first acts was to basically reclaim power from the Albany Stuarts, and this he did quite effectively. As part of these reforms, he also initiated new coinages. The groat, which is now known as the fleur-de-lis coinage, was now valued at 6p Scotch, and this was due to the rise of the price of silver in Scotland. That made silver more valuable, so obviously silver coins had higher purchasing power, and this was a trend that we'll see going forward throughout the 15th and the 16th century, where values of coins change all the time. Also, alongside these new silver coins, a new gold coin, the demi, was introduced, now worth 9 shillings. Now, it is interesting, going back to the coinage design here, with the silver coins in particular, we see that the Scottish coins, they still maintain the facing bust, but now a scepter has been introduced to the right of the bust, and you do get types where the scepter is also introduced onto the left side of the coin as well. So this may represent James's drive to actually reclaim royal authority and to introduce that aggressive kingship that he wanted to introduce in Scotland, that he witnessed when he was a captive in England under Henry V. So the idea of this scepter, installing the scepter on the coins, may be in relation with that. And also, of course, with the change of valuation of the Scottish coins, new design features had to be added so that the new values could be recognised compared to the earlier coinage as well. So this state of affairs in the Scottish coinage pretty much continued under the first half of James I's successor, James II. So James I was assassinated in 1437. And it brought the young James II to the throne. So he was a minor at the time when he became king. So again, Scotland was governed by a regency council until the 1450s, when James II achieved his majority and again exerted an aggressive kingship, an aggressive mode of government. And his sort of adult reign from the 1450s was dominated with intermittent civil war between the powerful Douglas family. But also in 1451, James attempted to bring the Scottish coinage more into line with the English coinage to try and get that that transparency back again for the exchange rates. We also see, with that reform, we see the introduction again of the gold lion, now worth 10 shillings. And we also see the introduction of a new groat, which was now worth 1 shilling. This groat was also known as the crown coinage, and will continue throughout the rest of James II's reign to the very varied reign of James III, which we now come on to. So James III's reign has a very interesting and very complex and very varied coinage, which I will not go into too much detail about. So I'm going to try and streamline this and keep it simplified as much as possible. At various times in James's reign, we see new denominations added and retracted. So, for example, in the gold, we see the introduction of a gold rider, which was worth 23 shillings Scots. we also see the introduction later on of the gold unicorn, which is worth 18 shillings Scots, and the introduction of a new billion denomination worth 4p, known as the plaque. And we also see an introduction of a new base silver groat, which is worth 6p. Again, we see the silver groats between 1460 and 84 continued to be issued at 12p or 1 shilling. But after 1484, it was increased by 2p to 1 shilling 2p. James's reign also sees the introduction of a copper coinage, and I'll talk more about the copper coinage in a little bit more detail in the next couple of slides. We also see coins minted at Berwick, following its temporary recapture in 1461. So part of the negotiations, because at this point England was embroiled in the Wars of the Roses, and Edward IV had just seized the throne, which meant that Henry VI, Margaret of Anjou, and her followers escaped to Scotland. As part of the negotiations for Scottish support, managed to acquire Berwick through those negotiations in return for Scottish support, which only the Scottish support that they gave was some loans and a very brief siege of Carlisle and a raid into Northumberland. Again, Berwick was recaptured in 1482 when Edward IV launched another invasion of Scotland. So I'll talk more about the political aspects of the coinage of James III and the design implications of this. With this varied coinage, we start to see some outside influences on the designs of the Scottish coins. So, for example, what we're seeing here on this slide is the gold rider, which was inspired by the French franc au cheval issued by Charles VII in the early 1430s. And then again, so this design shows the Scottish lion, the symbol of Scottish royal authority, and also a mounted figure on a horse. Again, the mounted figure on horses has been widely used in European coinage of the time, such as the Dutch, the coinage in the Low Countries. And later, the gold unicorn is an interesting coin because it is the first time on a Scottish coin that we actually see the symbol as the unicorn of Scottish royal authority and power. Again, the radiate sun was inspired by the French gold écu au soleil, which was introduced by Louis XI in 1475. Again, showing this outside influence on the Scottish coin design. But it's also tied up with how the Stuart dynasty, the Stuart monarchs of the time, wanted to be represented. Is the imagery on the coin is represented with Scottish royal authority and royal power. So at the time, and this is what the Stuart dynasty was really good at, was using imagery for enhancing its power and prestige. This was also a period when Scottish nationalism was really coming to the fore. So the tales of Robert the Bruce and William Wallace through the chronicles of Wintoun and Barber were really starting to develop the Scottish nationalism, and the Stuart kings from Robert III onwards were developing this Scottish national zeal on their coinage. So it wasn't just coinage that we're seeing these iconographies being physically portrayed. They were also portrayed in Scottish royal architecture, such as Linlithgow Palace, Stirling Castle. They were depicted on Scottish royal seals. And this was a way of the Stuart dynasty as well, also harking back that their kingship, their lineage, was backed based on sort of myth and legend, and it was trying to compete with England, that English always held domination, through myth and legend, through Brutus as the dominant force and rulers of the British Isles. But here was the Stuart monarchy fighting back in a way, saying that we are not subjected to this mythical English legend, but instead they're their own. and sort of harking back with the Stuart dynasty, with tracing their origins back to Robert Bruce, inspired by Robert's struggles with the Wars of Independence. So this was the Stuart monarchy's idea of presenting this royal iconography on these coins. And James III, with his very, very varied coinage, was also particularly good at it. Again, as we can see from this base groat, we can start to see changes in the bust style. So we're seeing this three-quarter profile bust that's starting to look a bit more realistic. But on the reverse of the coin, I can draw your attention to thistles in alternate angles. So this is the first time the thistle appears as a Scottish emblem on the coinage. So the other coins, I mentioned the introduction of a bill and plaque, which is worth 4p, because obviously the price, the rise of bullion in Scotland meant that coins were having to be produced of different denominations of higher values. And the bill and plaque was the largest bill and denomination issued at the time. But also under during James's reign, we see the introduction of a copper coinage. Now, this copper coinage was deeply, deeply unpopular. And it was one of the grievances that the nobles had and the people of Scotland had in the rebellion against James in the early 1480s, which resulted in several of his favourites being captured by the nobles and hung from a bridge at Lauder. So these copper coins can be sort of divided into sort of several types. So we've got the black farthings, which were issued in probably the 1460s, which were always classed as a regal issue. Then we have the more mysterious issues. So these were traditionally known as Bishop Kennedy pennies, after the Bishop of St Andrews, and cross-regal pennies, because there was a hoard of them, and there's lots found at Cross-Regal Abbey in Ayrshire. Now they are contemporary. Now they are known generally as Crux Pellet 3p pennies. We don't know exactly who produced these coins, but chances are they were a regal issue produced under license from James, from one of his favourites. Contemporaries called these coins Cochrane's plaques, after the name of one of James's favourites, Robert Cochrane, who was this deeply unpopular figure. So it naturally made sense to associate deeply unpopular coins with unpopular figures. And Robert Cochrane was one of these, one of James's favourites, who was actually hung from the bridge at Lauder in 1481. We don't know who produced these coins, so it's all still a bit of a mystery. Then the other coins, copper coins, were traditionally regarded as ecclesiastical issues, generally because of their reverse legend in various forms, which donates moneta pauper, money of the poor. These are now considered, rather than being ecclesiastical issues, again a regal issue. Who produced them, we don't know, but they always show they're always in the name of King James, with the legend Mo Pauper or Moneta Pauper in various guises, donating this is a money of the poor. So this was donating this copper coin, as these really base coins were to be used to help the poor with small change. But again, these copper coins were deeply, deeply unpopular, and so yeah, they weren't used. But surprisingly enough, they were deeply. The people in the Low Countries absolutely loved these coins. In fact, so much that vast amounts of them were actually exported from Scotland into the Low Countries, where they were even imitated. In fact, as well, there was also evidence of these Scottish copper coins actually being used as small change in Castile, in Spain, and some of the other northern Spanish kingdoms, again as small change. So while they were really unpopular in Scotland, continental Europe loved them. But this, so going back now to the imagery of James III and his use of it. Particularly, I'm going to talk about his one of his most famous coins, his heavy groat, which features a lifelike bust of the king. So this is the first, this is the earliest Renaissance coin outside of Italy that depicts a lifelike bust. So where did the inspiration and why did James want to decide now is a good time to put his likeness on a coin? So we've already mentioned sort of the role that certain iconography played on coins in bolstering up Scottish royal power. So the inspiration for this this coin largely again comes from the Italian Renaissance, where we start seeing in the 15th century portrait medallions being struck with lifelike busts of the rulers, Italian rulers. Again, we can point to the Sofesa Dukes of Milan, who are again pretty good at this, producing coins with their likeness on it. Again, Frederick II of Naples also started in 1458 started issuing coins with his own likeness on it. And the reason for this is that these rulers were facing political difficulties in their territories. So Frederick II of Naples was engaged in a struggle for the kingdom. So by imposing his likeness on a coin, he was showcasing his royal authority, his right to rule on this coin. And I'll talk a little bit more about that from a Scottish perspective in a second. So the idea of these images on coins stems from a developing new political theory, again, which was coming out through Renaissance Europe, that the king or rulers were actually emperors in their own kingdom. And this is quite clearly displayed on this coin of James, where we see an arched imperial crown. So this is effectively James's message, saying that he is emperor in his own kingdom. Indeed, the Scottish Parliament in 1469 pretty much said as much, that James had full sovereignty within his territories. And this is also promoting not only James's political ambition, but also the territorial ambitions of the Scottish monarchy at this time. You know, of the annexation of the Orkney Isles, and also James's continental ambitions as well. But we can also tie in with what is actually going on politically in Scotland at the time with this lifelike bust. So James was facing, in the 1480s, James was facing a lot of political resistance and resentment to his rule. So the idea that by putting his likeness on the coin, James was trying to justify his style of kingship to the people, but also to enhance his authority by combining his image, his lifelike image, on the money that people were using. Now, the Stuart kings, the Stuart monarchs, didn't really feel the need for displaying a lifelike bust, their unique likeness on coins. It was their uses were more better suited by promoting royal and iconography symbols associated with royal power rather than lifelike busts. As we'll see through the later slides, we'll see that actually very few issues of Scottish coins in the 16th century actually depict a lifelike bust of the monarch. So, following James's, so James was defeated and killed at the Battle of Socky-Burn in 1488. And he was succeeded by his young son, James IV. So compared to James III, James IV's coinage is pretty boring. We don't see that variety in James IV's coinage that we did in James III's. So principally, James IV's coinage can be divided into two main types: heavy and his light coinage, again based on weight reductions. So the heavy groat was worth 1 shilling 2 pence, and then the light groat, with its reduction in weight, was also reduced in value to 12 pence, so a shilling. We also see the gold unicorn still being struck, worth 18 shillings, and the gold lion or crown again makes its appearance from 1496. But also, interestingly, again, under James IV, and I'll show you some examples, that they revert back to the traditional style of busts. As we can see here on these examples. So gone are the lifelike busts that we've seen under the last coinage of James III. So we're going back to the more traditional busts. Why James IV quickly reverted back to the traditional bust is that it was really politically imprudent to have a lifelike bust of his predecessor on the coinage. So this was the time when conventional methods, conventional design still ruled the basic designs of coinage. And interestingly, James IV did not see the need to have a lifelike bust of himself depicted on the coinage in the same way that his father did. Potential reasons being that James IV was actually a successful king. And there's often debate about, and there's often been claimed that James III was Scotland's first Renaissance king. But actually, when you look at the court, the artwork, the style, and the patronage of James IV and James V, they are actually more appropriately classed as Scotland's first Renaissance kings. So the reason, again, why we're seeing James IV reverting this traditional design was a successful king. He did not see the need to put his likeness on the coins. Again, we're going back to the traditional on the Scottish gold. We're seeing the Scottish lion and St. Andrew being portrayed as symbols of Scotland and royal authority and royal power. So it is interesting that we do have documentary evidence from the James IV's reign that in political gift giving and gifts to emissaries and foreign ambassadors, that James actually used native Scottish gold coins for that purpose, whereas the day-to-day use of gold coins in Scotland was taken up mainly by the use of French and foreign gold coins. So it was more prudent and more prestigious to give these high-level ambassadors and dignitaries Scottish gold coins, emphasizing the power and prestige of Scottish Stuart monarchy at that time. So it's also worth mentioning as well that alongside the gold and silver coinages, we do have the Billen coins still being issued. So again, the plaque was issued in great numbers under James IV. Same again with the Billen penny, and these are again very common in the archaeological record in Scotland. So we do see a lot of these coins coming up. And it's also worth of note as well that another innovation in James IV's reign was the actual striking of the first official Maundy money. So this example in the slide shows the Maundy groat struck in 1512 specifically for the Maundy purpose. And we don't see that striking of Maundy money again until the 17th century. So that's another new innovation that was brought in towards the end of James IV's reign. So James IV's reign came to an untimely end. That, like his all his immediate predecessors, he died violently. So James I was assassinated. James II was blown up by a cannon at the siege of Roxburgh in 1460. James III was killed at Sockyburn, the Battle of Sockyburn in 1488. James IV was killed at the Battle of Flodden Fields in 1513, and again left another minor on the throne, James V. So James V's coinage can be divided into three main types, into three main phases. So his first coinage is basically a continuation of that of James IV, where the gold unicorn was continued to be issued, and as well as the bill and plaque. The second coinage is where we start to see a little bit more variety come in. So we start to see, so the gold crown comes back. We start to see a silver groat, which is now worth 1 shilling 6pence, again reflecting the rise in the price of the silver bullion, and the 1/3 groat. And then his third coinage sees the introduction of a gold ducat, also known as the bonnet piece, and also a new bill and denomination and its fractions. So these are just some of the examples of James V's coinage. Again, we don't have a great deal of variety that we saw in the reign of James III. Again, we are seeing the Scottish royal symbols of the lion being expressed on the coinage. Particularly, we see the re-emergence of the thistle again on the bill and bawbees as a Scottish royal emblem. Interesting as well on the silver groats with James in profile, again based loosely off the designs of the groats of Henry VII and Henry VIII that were being issued in England at the time. We also see again on these more realistic portraits of James V, the re-emergence again of the imperial crown. So that's that arched crown, something that we didn't see on the coins of James IV. And again, so on the ducat pieces, we start to see now again more Renaissance style of the hats being depicted rather than crowns on the king's busts, and that more or less covers the coinages of James V. So now we're getting on into the more interesting coinages where really the political messages were really starting to be hammered home, particularly in the reign of Mary and James VI. So this is where the coinages start to display really political rhetoric which reflects political thinking and iconography of what is going on in Scotland at the time. So an overview of Queen Mary's coinage. It is based on 5 periods in which her titles change on her coinage based on her various marriages, first to Francis of France and then to Henry Darnley. There are also represented distinct political phases numismatically represented. These get divided into these 3 periods. So the first period, 1542 to 50, when it was really just a continuation of the coinage of James V. Second was when 1550 to 1560 sees that period sees the regency of Mary of Guise, who is Mary's mother, and also a really tightening of the relationship between France and Scotland. In fact, it was even in this period that Scotland and France almost politically became one entity. And then the third period from 1560 to 67 sees the start of the Scottish Reformation and also the disengagement of Scotland's close political ties with France after Francis's death in 1561. So we also these phases and these periods also see a wide range of introduction of new denominations, which I will go into because it just complicates the story. So we have mainly the silver denomination introduced in 1553, worth £5 was the testoon. And new billion denominations such as the lion, also contemporarily known as the hardhead, is known as the hardhead based off the French billion coin known as the hardy, which was also we see a few examples of in Scotland. And also a 12-penny groat, which is known contemporary as the noncent. So I shall now delve more into these political iconographies about what we can see, what's shaping the political state of Scotland at this time during Mary's reign. So this slide shows some various examples of the coins of Mary during her reign. So the first, so the silver coin, the Mary Testoon, the first one prior to her marriage with Francis II, we see on this coin we have the cross Lorraine as the initial mark, and that was a symbol of Mary of Guise. So this is when Mary of Guise was regent of Scotland, and the early coinage of Mary in this phase prior to 1560 was all about promoting the allegiance with France. The religious messaging was promoting the power of the cross, and again showcasing, Catholic virtues. But we now start to see in 1560, we start to see a shift in the legend of the coinage of Mary and Francis. So I can draw your attention to the image in the bottom left of the screen. So this is another testoon of Francis II and Mary dating to 1560. So it names Francis and Mary as King and Queen of Scotland and France. But interestingly, the reverse legend changes. The Visit Leo legend is a Protestant innovation of the introduced on the coinage, because in 1560 the Scottish government was starting to be dominated by powerful Protestant lords, and this is the period when John Knox was started and George Buchanan really started to preach the Scottish Reformation. And indeed in 1560 is often seen as a traditional date at the start of the Scottish Reformation. And the significance of this legend on this coin, so this is radical at the time, given that Mary was still a Catholic queen, was the the Protestant lords beginning to dominate the Scottish government, was actually, rather than showcasing the power of the cross, was actually now showcasing the power and salvation through the Bible, through Scripture, rather than the cross, which was so the power of the cross was a Catholic, was more or less a Catholic innovation, a Catholic iconography, whereas this legend was more Protestant. But that didn't last long, because Mary returned to Scotland in 1561, and with it, more traditional, less radical legends began appearing on the coinage. So we're starting to see a return to this sort of less radical ideas in the legend, these messages that were coming across. But perhaps the most curious and interesting of all of Mary coins comes from this coin, which is the Scottish Ryle of Mary. So this was also known as the Palm Ryle, and contemporarily it was known as the Crookston Dollar. So this design is very interesting because it shows the high level of input that Mary must have had in designing this coin. So what it represents, there's been several debates about what this design actually represents. It was known as the Crookston Dollar because legend has it that when Mary and Henry Darnley were first courting, they were doing it under the yew tree at Crookston. Again, there's absolutely no evidence of this whatsoever. So the palm tree itself So this design, it may actually be a representation of Mary, signifying her virtues, the strength of her dynasty, because in 1566 she had just married Henry Darnley. She was already pregnant with the future James VI, and I think it was also the year that James VI was actually born. So this was signifying her virtues and the strength of the Stuart dynasty of and the continuation of that dynasty, but also as well politically in Scotland, Mary had just got one over on her Protestant opponents through the chase about raids, which lasted a few months, which pitted her and Darnley against the Protestant lords. So in this case, Mary was victorious over the Protestant lords in this period. So again, this design may reflect her growing confidence that, hold on, we defeated these Protestant lords here, and also signifying the strength of her dynasty and her virtues as a queen and as a woman. The palm tree itself was also used in various medals and literature, not just on coins, but in iconography across Europe, principally from Italy. And given that Mary's early education was pretty much in France, was also used imagery of the palm trees, signifying strength, signifying virtue, fertility. So it was used on to donate. There was a medallion from the female ruler of Padua, displaying a palm tree as well. Again, this design, it may signify other interpretations of this design. It may signify the victory of the Catholic knights over the Moorish Turks in the siege of Malta in the 1560s. Again, we don't know, but that iconography was that event was widely played out in Italy, especially in Sicily at the time after the sort of the Catholic victories over the Muslim Turks at the siege of Malta. So this is just a way that so these coins of Mary are now beginning to show the political thought that was generating in Scotland from a shift of political power and thought, from the early period dominated by Mary of Guise and the regent Arran, signifying sort of political unity, Catholic virtues, power of the cross, and the allegiance and close ties with France, to, in 1560, a more radical design on the silver testoons with the legend, signifying the beginning of the input and power of the Scottish Protestant lords, and then to Mary's own private devotions and feelings on the coinage. Interestingly, there is no contemporary records about the actual general public's reaction to the designs, to this design on the Mary Riles. But we're continuing the theme with design and meaning when we now move into the reign of James VI. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about each different type of James's coins, because there are a lot of them. But broadly speaking, there were 8 prior to 1603. There were 8 coinages with different denominations in each coinages. The Billen coinages, which ceased in Scotland in 1560, were now resumed again in 1583 and continued until 1597. We also have countermarking on these coins, which I'll talk about in more detail a little bit later. And of course, after 1603, after the unity of the crown, Scotland still had a unique coinage, but it was more in line with the English, and we have a 12-to-1 ratio operating on both sides of the border, which meant that a Scottish shilling worth 12 pennies in Scotland would be worth 1 penny in England. So So an English penny would then be worth 12 pence in Scotland. But it's more about, with James's coins, it's more about the imagery and the propaganda that I want to talk to you about today. So Mary was violently overthrown in 1567. She was forced to abdicate. And James, being raised as a Protestant, came to the throne. So this was now really, the Protestant regime had now really taken over. And this is really reflected in the design of James's first coinage, the ryle. So this has an interesting design. So the input, so the very personal design that we saw with Mary's ryles, with the palm tree, was very, very quickly replaced with this new design and new legend, showing a sword and a hand. So this actually, the person who's probably responsible for this design and for this message was George Buchanan, who was a leading Protestant scholar and humanist at the time and was also James's tutor. So with this design, the sword and the hand, he is harking back to the legend, the old Roman legend that was mentioned by Cassius Dio of the Roman Emperor Trajan presenting a sword to the Praetorian Guards prefect, meaning that if he was a bad emperor, you can use this sword to kill me. So this design is actually emphasizing that if you're a bad ruler, you can be removed, which is what the Protestant regime were trying to justify the removal of Mary, that she was a bad ruler and hence why she had to be removed. And this message really, and nothing strikes home more than that message of a sword and a hand, harking back to old classical scholarship, meaning that bad rulers can be removed. So this was the Protestant regime justifying their removal of Mary, but also signifying to James that if you rule badly, you can be removed. And this is what George Buchanan, as James's tutor, wanted to instill in James. George Buchanan wanted to make James into a God-fearing Protestant ruler who respected the value and the limitations of royal power and rule. And going through James's coins throughout his pre-Union reign, we start to see this iconography and the legends on all of James's coinage. So all of these, pretty much most of his coinage, his silver and his gold, were promoting just rule, the power of the godly power of kings. So this is when he was starting to advocate the right, the divine right of kings and just rule. And nothing, I think, of all the coins of James's pre-1603 issues, no coin emphasizes this link with the divinity and earthly rule than his hat piece, his 6 coinage. On the reverse of this coin, it has a lion with a scepter reaching up to heaven with, in Hebrew, the word Jehovah in Hebrew above the cloud. And this was a period when Old Testament texts and Hebrew texts in particular was actually becoming quite popular, not just in Scotland but across post-Reformation Europe. So in this case, in this design, on the hat piece is actually signifying James's link to the divine, is actually signifying that the lion is representing earthly kingly power, reaching up, connecting to Jehovah, the Hebrew God, the divine. So linking that earthly kingly power comes from the divine. So it's almost effectively emphasizing the divine right of the kings, which was James was keen to promote. Again, the other coin that we can see here, the balance half mark, is signifying this. What James was other keen to promote was signifying the rule of justice and law, that he was the embodiment of justice and law. He was He was promoting just causes. He was a just ruler. If we go back to what James's Ryle mentioned, the sword with the hand, that poor rulers, unjust rulers can be removed. James was here promoting just rule, that he was defender of the justice. He was acting within the laws. Hence the balance, hence the scales of justice, and the sword representing justice and power as well. We can see again from the 30 shilling piece with the bust of the young king crowned in armor with a ruff, holding a sword. Again, highlighting justice, highlighting good rule. This was, again, what James's big passion was, highlighting these just rule, new political thought, new religious thought as well, while promoting, the Protestant cause as well. And then we have some various examples of coins, such as this ducat, which goes back to the traditional designs, traditional legends as well. So it's all about, it's all about linking the divine with earthly kingly rule. So it's interesting to know that after 1603, the James's coins in Scotland and indeed in England no longer were promoting kingly and divine rule and justly rule. They're more concerned with promoting the actual union between England and Scotland. But it's interesting to note that on James's Billen coins, we didn't have this messages of divine kingship or earthly justice. They were the Billen coins were the traditional iconography showing the Scottish royal arms and generally where the coins were minted. So the general inscriptions were Oppidum Edinburgh, minted in Edinburgh. So they didn't have that religious or political messaging that the higher denominations did. And the reason for that was that these Billen coins were tended to be used by the lower levels of society, where the meanings of just rule and through imagery and legends weren't meant to be interpreted. So those coins with the higher up denominations, those messages would tend to be to the people that pretty much who the government depended on. So we're looking at merchants, we're looking at government bureaucrats, rather than sort of the day-to-day people, the poorer levels of society, who may not have understood or been able to read the legends and the symbology, which is why the Billen coinage were kept to the traditional design, showcasing royal power. So I shall briefly mention the countermarking of coins and why they did it. So as part of the economic struggles in Scotland at the time, which is why we see 8 different coinages of James VI, was the different revaluations, the price of bullion increasing. Indeed, through James's reign, we see legislation being enacted that would stop the import, particularly in 1578. We see the exportation of Scottish bullion abroad being banned. Older coins that were in circulation, such as this Mary Testoon, were countermarked and revalued as part of the bullion pressures and the economic pressures that Scotland was at the time. And also in 1575, because previously, earlier on in James's reign, there were a lot of parliamentary complaints about the Billen coinages, particularly of Mary, being counterfeited. Normally, these coins were actually widely counterfeited and imported from. These counterfeits were widely produced from the Low Countries and imported into Scotland. So the idea of countermarking these with the heart and star was to differentiate genuine copies from forgeries. So the genuine coins were countermarked with the heart and star to separate them from forgeries. And it seems that this was generally a success, because in the documentary record, there seems to be less complaints about the counterfeits of bill and coins. So this is just the final thoughts and kind of like summing up about what I've talked about. So the Scottish coinage from sort of 1393 to 1603 saw a lot of change. So the changes were sometimes rapid. Sometimes denominations would come and go over years. The valuations of the coins changed as well. From a numismatic point of view, we have lots of different complex typologies as well, which I did not go into today. So it does see, Scotland sees a lot of change, so not just economically, but also in political and religious thoughts. How the Stuart monarchs made use of nationalistic iconography on their coins and their buildings and their general on their seals. We're also seeing as well the outside influences, again on coin designs, but also on political thoughts influencing coin designs and how government political theories, how government should be carried out, and the idea of kingship and rule. We've also seen lots of variety in the designs across these coins and what these designs can actually symbolize and actually mean, and how the designs change in relation with, political thought and also religious change as well. And then finally, obviously this was just a very, very brief run through from all these coins and a little dip into the theories behind these coins and their influences and their design meanings. If you like to sort of read more and dive more into this, this is just a selection of further reading that deals with these further types. So it's the history of the coinage, it's more of the economic role of coins, differences in typologies, and all that as well. And of course, and this is shameful self-promotion here, that my thesis, my completed PhD thesis that I'm turning into a BAR volume, actually does cover a lot of the design meaning of coins, not just what we're seeing in the 15th and 16th century, but also in the earlier period as well. And that concludes the talk of the second part of the coinage of the Scottish coinage of Robert III to James VI. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Carl. That was really brilliant and so different from your first talk. The coins completely changed, didn't they?
Mm-hmm.
They looked very English in the first talk, and now they've really sort of come into their own. And maybe we need to do another talk on topologies at some point, as you said, they're quite complicated. Okay, so I'm going to, if you've got any questions, please post them in the chat. I'm just going to post as well the MMN email. If for whatever reason you cannot type in the chat, please send an email to the inbox. I'll be keeping an eye on that as well.
Yeah, just to reiterate what Campbell said there, if you do have also any further questions, please do feel free to email me as well, and I'll do my best to answer them.
Do you want to put your email in the chat, Carl, and then people will have access to it there as well?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I'll just stop sharing my screen if I can.
Okay.
Bear with me. What's it doing? There we go. There we go. That's sorted. Yeah, just a little bit of a sort of computer malfunction there on my part.
By the way, Carl, I do have a question. You were showing off the copper coins, and you said they weren't very popular. Was there a major reason that people weren't so receptive to them?
Yes, sorry, I'm just answering this question while typing up my email address. So these coins, so these were the first copper coins that we see in Scotland. In fact, in Europe, I mean, it was just highlighting that. So the whole idea of coins at this period, it was based on intrinsic value. Copper coins had no intrinsic value whatsoever. They're almost like a token coinage, and so so they didn't really have much function in the economy at the time, and they were just a symbol and a physical manifestation of the complete mismanagement of the Scottish economy. And the other
Mm.
problem is that with that as well is that, well, no one would accept them. So it's like, well, you're paying for your goods in with crooks pellet free pennies. Well, that's no good. How am I going to get that money back? So
Sounds a bit like Roman radiate, like late Roman radiate coinage. Um,
yeah, very much so. Yeah, very much so. But it's probably why they were discontinued, and we don't see a copper coinage again in Scotland until 1597, when the last billion coins of James VI were pretty much copper coins. His pennies were produced in copper, and then of course post Union we see all the copper coinage.
Thank you. We have a question from Georgia. She asks, could Carl say a bit more specifically about who was designing the coins? Is it the monarchs? Do we know that for sure? Nice example on the Protestant coin.
Which period, Georgia, are we talking? Are we talking the whole period, or do you have a specific period in mind? Because there's two different answers to this question depending on the period. Whole. All right. Okay. So the whole period. So the input is always assumed to be royal input, and this is going back to the days of the first talks. So it would have been royal input into the design of this coins. So it would have been, royal input, and it would have been government advisors as well. It's the idea is kind of like, well, what message do you want to portray? So the idea with the earlier coinage, the engraver with the Stuart monarchy being very, very descended from Robert the Bruce, and with the rise of Scottish nationalism in the 14th, 15th centuries, it was a good idea and a good symbology to sort of counteract English aggression in a way. Later on, we're starting to see the input. We're starting to see, particularly with the Mary Protestant coin, that is probably very much so from the Protestant lords. Again, we see a change of mint master under the Protestant lords, so it's the only period in the 16th century where the Archiston family, who dominate the Scottish mints, who are masters of the Scottish mint, were actually not in charge. So they were brought back in the 1560s. So this was pretty much the Protestant lords having input into that, and with Mary's coinage, the Catholic, particularly under the regencies of the Earl of Arran and Mary of Guise, it was pretty much their input going into the design of those coins. And their political agendas, promoting the union with France, and Mary's very personal design with the Palm Royal, that was her own input. And then, so later on under James, we're seeing George Buchanan's influence very strongly in his early coinage. And as later as James grew up and assumed control of the government, we are seeing his input directly in there. So James's regime prior to the Union kept a really tight control. He was interested in the role of coinage as a vehicle of propaganda to promote these new political ideologies. So him and his advisors kept a very tight control of those coinages. So with each new coinage, we're seeing a new idea about what James is wanting to promote on it. So it is generally royal. We are looking at royal input for most of these coins.
Okay, thank you, Carl. I don't see any more currently in chat, but I have another question. I was sort of wondering how much of an influence, let's say, like Queen Elizabeth had on like Scottish coinage in this period, because I know like she did a big rejig of the English currency system during her reign
She did,
and
but
introduced all new sorts of types.
Not many, not much is the simple not much is the simple answer. The thing is, with English coinage in this period, English coinage was very conservative. They stayed with tried and tested designs. That even though Elizabeth was the Protestant queen, she still had Catholic legends on the reverse of her coins that were used from the days of Edward III, and that were just stayed literally on the coinage from Edward III. So Elizabeth's sort of revaluation and restabilization on big recoinage in 1560, 1561, it didn't really have that much of an impact on the design of Scottish coins. We know that again, it's the beauty of the Stuart monarchy using symbolism rather than the need of lifelike busts to promote royal power. Whereas on Elizabeth's coins, she had the bust, she had the royal arms. They had the lifelike bust with the change of each monarch. So the impact of Elizabeth's coin designs probably reflected very little in the contemporary Scottish coins. I mean, we don't see it in the iconography.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. This isn't my wheelhouse at all. So, I'm learning a lot from all of the medieval talks we've been doing lately. I don't see any more in the chat currently or in the Q&A section, and I've been keeping an eye on the inbox. Again, if you do have any questions, feel free to email me, and I'll ask Carl now. Otherwise, Carl's email is in the chat. Whilst we wait to see if there are any more questions, next month's talk will be with Sam Moorhead, and it will be an introduction on late Roman coins in Britain. So that will be on the 21st of May. Registrations will open up, I'm hoping, next week. It sort of depends when I can get to it. Okay, so I'm not seeing any more questions, so I guess I'll thank you again, Carl. This was really an interesting talk, and as Carl said, if you have questions, feel free to contact him. And with that, I will end the call. So thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you very much.